All right, today it's been a little while,
Yeah.
but we're diving back into our Final Fantasy playthrough. So, just a refresher: Matthew and I are playing through all of the Final Fantasy games, 1 through now 16,
Yeah. Yeah.
and this series is really focused on like the building of that franchise and like how it changes from installment to installment and um, even like platform to platform, right? 'Cause there's
Yeah.
some huge changes there. So we've got a big pod on Final Fantasy One. We did, I don't know, maybe 3 months ago. So if you haven't listened to that one,
Yeah.
go back and take a listen. We kind of explained all the ground rules for what we're doing in this series. So this one we're jumping straight into Final Fantasy Two, never released here in North America, at least not originally.
No,
Uh,
yeah, not in its initial form.
yeah, not in the initial form. Came out in 1988 in Japan. I think I think the first version we got was maybe the PlayStation version. Is that right?
That sounds right. I'm not 100%, but I believe that sounds correct. The first one that came over this way, part of one of those packs, right? Like one of they had a couple
Yeah,
collections on the PlayStation. I believe that was when we first got it.
yeah,
At
I
least
think
that
so
was my
too.
first exposure to it. That was when I first learned about it.
Yeah, yeah, me as well. But since then, we've got a ton of different versions.
Yep.
For my playthrough, I played the Pixel Remaster. I think that's what you
Yep.
played too.
Yeah,
Yep,
yeah. That's what I went with. So.
sweet. All right,
Uh,
let's.
Interesting game, right? I mean,
Yeah,
I kind of just want to get right into it, right? That this is
yeah,
a strange Final Fantasy. It's a weird one. It's there's a lot that it does that is foundational, and there's a
sure.
lot that it does that we never see again, which
At
I
least
think
not
is
in this
really interesting.
series.
Right, right. And we'll talk about that. I mean, obviously, this is going to be, a favorite of mine of the series for obvious reasons. If you've listened to this podcast at all, big fan of Saga and Akitoshi Kawazu. Big hand in this particular entry, right? The lead director of the Saga series had a big part to play in a lot of the kind of divisive changes for this particular entry. So let's just get into a couple of those because the big ones really are sort of the Saga influences, being that no longer is there an experience system in this game, right?
Gone.
Final Fantasy 1 through 16, with the exception of this game, pretty much all have a leveling system, right? Capping out often at level 99. Your stats go up at a pretty unified rate depending on the character and their job or role within the game. Not the case here, right? So in this game instead, right, you build your characters how you want by having them use the abilities, right, that you want them to excel at. The more often you attack with physical weapons, the higher their strength goes. The more often they cast spells, the higher their intelligence goes. HP from getting hit, right, MP from casting spells.
That's why you hit yourself so much, right?
Exactly. I mean, that is a strategy, right? One of the early
Yeah.
strategies for this game was hit yourself a bunch, equip 2 shields at the beginning, bash yourself a bunch, and just ramp your defense and hit points up real high at the beginning of the game. So it does have, classes, if you will, right? Like you do have classes. They don't level up and they don't change really
Yeah.
throughout. You can assign a lot of different stuff to different characters in the game. But what are your thoughts on that about removing the experience system from the game and having your level ups be associated with what you do with your character? Does it work for you? Does it not? Like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I didn't like it at first at all because I was expecting. I didn't read anything about Final Fantasy II going into it.
Yeah.
I was sort of aware of it because of the PlayStation 1 version, but hadn't played it, hadn't read any reviews, just like growing up back in the 90s, like we didn't have it. So
Yeah.
never even thought about it. So I went in kind of blind, and coming off of playing the first one, I
Hmm.
expected something very similar, at least in the leveling system.
Right.
And that was totally different. But the more I played, the more I liked it. And I don't like the Saga games. Like I've tried,
Right.
I just can't get into them. But I think it is a much more organic way to build your characters.
Hmm.
You are getting better at the stuff that you're actually doing.
Right.
And
Right.
I think that's a really fascinating way to level up, so to
Yeah.
speak.
Yeah. I like that it gives you the ability to kind of tailor without having to rely on a job system. It gives you an ability to tailor your party in a unique way, right? So the characters don't really change stylistically from the beginning of the game to the end, but their builds and what they excel at can be modified and adjusted as you go through, which I think is
Yeah.
really cool.
And just gives you so many opportunities for customization.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like
Yeah.
almost unlimited.
Right. For a game, though, that is kind of narrow in what it lets you do, right? I mean, it doesn't have any of the complicated, job actions that we're going to see in Final
Sure.
Fantasy 3, right? Like it's still mostly attack, magic, item, right? Like those are your options in the game. But the different weapons you equip, right? The different spells you assign to your characters all have, differences in how they affect the game. Elemental weaknesses are a big part of this game, and one thing that you'll learn really quickly is in this game, if you want to excel, magic is really important, right?
Oh
But
yeah.
it is incredibly time consuming to get good at all magic, right? So you have to kind of spread your party out based off of elements, right? You might make one character, excel at ice magic so that they can farm, strong ice magic by the end of the game. Someone else might go lightning, fire, healing spells, whatever it is, because what this system also does is it revamps the magic system completely, right? It's a wholly unique magic system for this series, as far as I'm aware. But it also is the first game to introduce an MP system, right? Final
Yeah.
Fantasy One, you had sort of D&D style spell slots, right? You could cast a certain number of spells for each level, right, as you went along. In this game, we have the MP system for the first time, right? You cast a spell, it takes mana points away from you, magic points away from you, and you replenish those with ethers or resting at inns or whatever it is. You gain them by casting more spells. Um, so I thought this was pretty interesting. You can't go and buy Firaga either, right?
Right.
In this game, you level up your magic by using it just as you level up your character. So the more often you cast fire, eventually you'll have fire 2, fire 3, fire 4, fire 5, right? All up to, I
Saves you
can't
a little
remember
money.
the cap is. Yeah. I don't remember what the exact cap is. It might be 12, 10 or 12, I think. It
Can't
goes up
remember.
really high. But the more you grind and use certain spells, the stronger they get. So plus side, you can curate what spells one character is really strong at, and by the end of the game, you can have a character who's like full healing your party for nothing, right? Real
Right.
simple. But you might get in a fight where the only elemental weakness is ice, and you've only got one guy that's any good at ice, and so fights can drag a little bit like that if you're not careful. Uh,
Another thing about magic, I didn't realize this until I was reading about it right before we started talking today. But in the original version, if you use black magic, I think it had a negative impact on your physical attack. I
oh,
think I'm
interesting.
remembering that correct. Yeah, so they've gotten rid of that in the Pixel remaster, but it was even a more complicated
Mm-hmm.
system
Yeah.
for almost sort of like not allowing you to have those characters who can do it all.
Yeah, yeah. And so it was interesting because I found myself as I was playing this game really sort of diversifying my party in ways that like some of the other games, like as I'm playing through three, I'm most of the way through three right now. And with the job system, it's really cool because you have a lot of variety, but there's certain moments in the game where you're kind of forced into homogenizing your party to overcome certain, dungeons or bosses or obstacles or whatever. And it can feel kind of boring in that respect because like there's like
Yeah.
a system, there's like a here's what you have to do to succeed here, here, and here. Two doesn't really have that, like with the exception of a few bosses who are like pretty much immune to magic or physical damage. As long as you are leveling some magic on all your characters and leveling some physical attack on all of your characters, you're pretty much going to succeed. And you can then within that play around a lot. You get Holy and Ultima later in the game, and you can go ahead and buff up those spells if you want. But by that point, you're so far along with just the base elemental spells that there isn't really even a point sometimes in taking the time to do that. Um, but it's pretty fun. Like I enjoy that element of it, though something is lost, right? In
Yeah.
having hunting down new spells to buy for your characters, and having specific role assignments that your characters kind of fall into that really feel developed as they will later on. But
Well, let me hit you with this.
yeah,
This is the first time. I mean, we've only played two of these games, at least in the
yeah,
series. But of all the Final Fantasy games that I've played, this is the only one I think that has a true like meta game where it's really about
yeah.
optimization. Like
Hmm.
you're playing the game to play the game, and
Yeah,
that's the piece that I really can't stand.
yeah, it does feel like it feels that way. Though I would argue that three does in smaller instances, right? Like there's in three, there's a fight with Garuda that if you don't essentially make your party all dragoons, you're not going to win the fight. Like it's almost
Ah,
impossible to win the
okay.
fight. So there's moments like that, right, where like you have to play certain ways, but they're not, like you said, like you don't have to lock into buying into, okay, I need to grind, with just shields on for a little while in order to have optimal health and defense
Yeah.
for, the first couple dungeons. And then at that point, I need to start focusing on my magic. And I know that coming as a boss that's going to be pretty much completely, immune to physical attack. So I need to have my spells at this level by this point in order to, yeah, like there is some of that in two. I don't think it's as punishing though as some of the other games can be. It's no, World of Darkness in 3, right?
Oh,
The
yeah,
final
yeah.
dungeon. Like, there's never these moments where if you don't do it, you can't just like pause for a bit and go back and grind and fix your characters. Like, you can't break your characters, I don't think, right? But you're
You have
you're
to try
correct
really
that,
hard.
yeah, but you're correct in that, like, if you don't level up magic on at least a couple of characters, you will not clear the game. Like, it's almost
Yeah.
impossible to do so. There are some sort of really hard roadblocks there. And if you don't have good enough, HP, you don't do enough random battles, take enough hits, you're going to be a little underleveled in the HP department by the end of the game. So yeah, there is some of that, which is weird.
And I don't know how you would not take on enough random battles because every 2 steps
Insane.
there's an
Insane
encounter.
encounter, right? These original games, I think that's one of the things that's standing out as we're doing these replays. These first couple games, like, I mean, I'm gonna imagine it's gonna continue all the way up to like 7, 8, right? Like,
Yeah.
random encounters, I have forgotten how bad it used to be in some of these games. Two in particular, yeah, I think, every like 5-10 steps, especially if you're running, like you have to not run in the game in order
Right,
to
we were
avoid,
texting
like,
about this when
yeah.
we first started because I could not make it further than, like, 5 steps.
And there's a lot of games do that, but like it feels really aggressive in some of these games, like in some of these early Final Fantasies. Like you really got to take your time, but still, even with that, you're getting encounters pretty regularly. The good news is, again, the game's not super difficult with the,
Yeah.
the speed up from the pixel remasters and a lot of that, like the auto battle system and the, the repeat attacks. Like, you can breeze through it. I think in total, what is my playtime on this game? I want to say it was only somewhere in the neighborhood of like 15 hours to complete the whole game, right?
I
Which
think mine was
is,
something like that too.
yeah, it's not a significant investment. So 12 hours. I beat the game in 12 hours, right? Which is not, that's not a big ask. That's pretty simple, straightforward,
Sure.
length. But with the random encounters, I would say, 7 of those hours were in battle, right?
Right.
We're in combat. Easily 7 of those hours, if not more, were in combat because of the random encounter rate.
So if you're playing the original and you don't have the speed up and you're grinding through this is going to take you, I don't know, 30 hours.
It can be
It's
tricky. Yeah.
significant. Yeah.
Yeah. And we
Hey, what?
never see this again, right? We never see this kind of system again with the really, leveling up spells through usage, stats, raising as you move stuff. That moves into the Saga series and pretty much drops completely from Final Fantasy after this game.
Yeah. What do you make of the dialogue or keyword progression where you have to go to the right person, know the right
Right.
NPC to say the right keyword to so that
Yep.
you can progress the story?
So we talked about this in Final Fantasy 1, right? Like, you learn all of the story by talking to random NPCs. Sometimes NPCs that you would not think would have anything to do with the story, that look exactly like every other generic NPC in town, has like a really crucial detail.
Yeah.
Well, in this game, they take it to an entirely new level, right? I think it's called like the world system, world memory system or something like that, where you talk to a guy, he gives you a keyword, then you have to take that keyword to someone else that you've talked to. What's wild about this is, yes, again, Saga all over. This is Kawazu to a T, right? Like,
Oh,
Saga
is
does
it?
this too, where, in the romancing Saga games, like, we don't, it's not the keyword system, but like, you have to go talk to people at specific times after hitting specific invisible triggers in order to
Ah,
progress quests and story elements. And there's missable quests and missable story elements if you don't talk to the right people at the right time. This game does a similar thing. Nothing's missable per se, right? But like, you have to go talk to a guy, and you might talk to him and he doesn't have a keyword, and it turns out that all you have to do is talk to someone who's standing next to him and then go
And then
back
go
to
back.
him,
Yeah.
and on the second conversation he'll give you a keyword that you then have to take back across the world, talk to one person, talk to another person, the third person you talk to after you've talked to these other people will finally have something. And it's like, how would you learn this on your own, right? It's
Yeah.
very trial and error, and I think that to me is what, like, it's not my favorite part about the Saga series. Like, I like the very open, like, you stumble upon stuff, but in
Sure.
Saga, it's like you stumble onto like side quests, and you can still complete the game. If you miss some of these triggers, you just might miss out on side quests. The ending might be a little different. You might not fight certain bosses, whatever, but that adds replayability. In Final Fantasy II, that's not really the case. It's more just trial and error, brute force your way until you get the right keyword and talk to the right person. And so it feels a little bit exhausting.
Yeah, and if you're not using a guide, I mean, even if you are using a guide, but if you're not using a guide, you're wasting a lot of time going back and forth
Mm-hmm.
across the map. The
Yep.
backtracking drove me nuts.
It's
So
insane.
you talk to this guy in one city, and then you have to go to a totally different city, talk to somebody else, like you said, give them the
Mm-hmm.
password you just got, and then go back to the first guy.
Yeah. The
It,
first game had a lot of backtracking. This game, they double down on how often you revisit places. It's
yeah,
crazy.
you were going to get
Yeah.
your money's worth out of this game.
Yeah. And, and that's some of, I think, my big critiques here is that there's a lot of stuff in this game for a game that only took me 12 hours, right? I used a guide, so I want to be clear on that. Like, these old games, I'm not going to bumble through this for 40 hours. I don't have the time, I don't have the patience. But playing through this with a guide 12 hours, I would say you're looking at double that if you're trying to do this on your own, because there's
Oh yeah,
some triggers in this game, some dialogue that if you're not paying attention, like if you just zone out for a second, you're going to miss a really crucial keyword, a really crucial like hint towards where you're supposed to go next, and you'll just be wandering. And like you said, a lot of times you're literally traversing one side of the map to the other in order to complete an objective. And if you don't know that, if you miss something, or you're not quite remembering early on a character from a town and where they currently are located, it can take a really long time because characters sometimes move, right? They change
oh
locations.
yeah,
They're no longer where you've had found them the first time. And so it can get very hard to keep track of all of it. And to me, that was like, it felt like artificial padding, right? Like they wanted to extend the length of the game. They did that by throwing in a lot of backtracking and this weird keyword system that I don't think lands as well as it can. But there's a couple of other things I want to talk about, though, that this game does that I think are highlights of not just this game, but the series, right? Like, this game establishes some tropes that will last for all the way up until modern day Final Fantasy, right? Final Fantasy 16, the all-star character in that game, the one that everyone's talking about, is Cid, right?
yep,
There would be no Cid without Final Fantasy II. He was not in the first game. He shows up here in the second game with a pretty significant role for a game that doesn't really have much in the way of story or it's got some significant characters and it's got some major story beats, but it's definitely not like Final Fantasy 4 through 16 as far as story goes.
yeah.
But we get Cid for the first time. We get Chocobos, right? Chocobos show up for the first time. You get to ride them around the continent for a little while. A lot of really unique elements of the game. But one thing that I wanted to ask you about, and this isn't really, I mean, we're going to be talking spoilers, so this is spoilers. I'm not gonna name names, but this is a game where your party is essentially 3 characters for the majority of the game, with a fourth that rotates in and out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that fourth character is not always going to survive the day, right? Like, there are character deaths in this game, permanent character deaths, which the series still struggles with sometimes to stick to. I just think it's really interesting that this game, something that people gave Final Fantasy VII stars for, right? For its big character death. This game was doing, back in 1988.
Yeah.
I mean, it's got some really cool elements in it. Some, the Dark Knight makes his first appearance, right, which will become an iconic Final Fantasy character class for the remainder of the series. I mean, how does this game like feel as far as like the elements of Final Fantasy, right? When we talk about what makes Final Fantasy, how does it mesh with you? Does it, despite the weird combat system, the strange magic system, the tedious kind of backtrack and all that, how does it resonate with you as a Final Fantasy game?
This one was the first one of the first two that really felt like a Final Fantasy game to me. The first one felt like a Dragon Quest game,
Yeah.
and I think for good reason, right?
Hmm.
Um, but this is the first one that actually felt like a Final Fantasy game,
Yeah.
and I can give the weird combat and some of that stuff a pass because Final Fantasy is about experimentation with the
Hmm.
combat system, right?
Yeah.
It's always been, even the leveling system. Like if you look at like another extreme, Final Fantasy X with the spear grid, right? Like
Yeah.
that was experimentation with how your character unlocks certain moves and abilities and stuff.
Hmm.
Um, and I just can give them a pass for it. It wasn't my favorite. I don't
Yeah.
love the saga games like we talked about, but it's starting to feel like form that core of what I think a Final Fantasy game is. What did Yoshi P say? Final Fantasy has to have the best graphics, the
Yeah.
chocobos, and like when he said that about 16, I was reflecting on just playing through 2, and I was like,
Hmm.
I can feel that here. That's like starting to come through in Final Fantasy 2. It's starting to get its own like aesthetic and
Yeah.
personality, and I don't know, it just felt Final Fantasy to me. What about you?
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the thing is we talk about the series and we're gonna we can't avoid talking about what makes a Final Fantasy game, right? Like people are gonna want to know our thoughts on that. People, anyone who's interested in this conversation wants to know that's a big sticking point right now with 16 discourses. Is it a Final Fantasy game? What makes a Final Fantasy game? And I think that obviously the experimentation is Final Fantasy, right? Pushing
Yeah,
boundaries, trying new things, sometimes they don't work, is what Final Fantasy is. And it's really cool to see, even with what was it, 1 year turnaround from Final Fantasy 1 to Final Fantasy 2,
I think
right?
so.
I
It
think it
was
was
something
fun.
like
I
that.
think it was 87 when the first game came out. Even then, right, with 87. So with a single year, right, of development time, they decided, hey, let's just scrap some of the stuff that we did in this first game, despite the fact that it sold really well. Obviously they were probably already pretty far in development before they realized it was a success, but to have it, come out, do so much different with the series from number two, right? To say, hey, we're
Yeah.
still trying to figure out what this series is. And then from that point forward, right, they never really slow down, right? They just continue to iterate on, what can we push and change and, modify in a Final Fantasy game. Because I believe in 3, the MP system disappears again. We get the I think it doesn't 3 have the spell slot system
I
again,
can't
at
remember.
least in the
You might be
original
right.
version. But like they still don't really know, right? For a while, they're not going to really get into a groove with Final Fantasy until maybe 4 or 5, right? Is when we
Yeah.
start to see more of like really recognizable, like this is what it is. I mean, obviously we've got the crystals, right? Those are going to show up in pretty much every Final Fantasy game.
Yeah.
You got you know the big mysterious end bosses that often sometimes will show up just unexpectedly towards the end of the game and reshape what you thought about everything that was going on before and all of this. But overall, this is really cool to see it kind of find its groove, right?
Yeah.
The stuff that is Final Fantasy is still very recognizably Final Fantasy, right? The world building, the spell names and abilities, the combat system, as far as like the turn-based combat system and menu selects and all of that, like all of that feels very Final Fantasy and will continue to feel that way for a long time. But they never just kind of settle, and I think that's really cool. I think that it's also cool that this particular game um, clearly was inspirational enough, right, that you see elements of it continue into the Saga series and other games right around this time. I mean, it's not just kind of like the black sheep of the Final Fantasy series and
Yeah.
that's all we ever think of it as. It's, the black sheep of the Final Fantasy series, but also a starting point for so much of what, the series would become. And I think that's really cool.
Yes. I totally agree. Two quick points from me on just to close out my thoughts on this. The first one, this game has my favorite. Well, it's at least like top three Final Fantasy art
It's really
of.
good.
It's so good. If you've got
Really
the
good.
pixel remaster version, you can go in and take a look at some of the concept art and stuff. I think it's hands down some of my favorite art.
Yeah.
Um, so that's one thing. The second thing is I'm looking forward to how our conversation progresses as we move through the franchise,
Hmm.
because I think you've alluded to this already, but at some point in Final Fantasy, story became really important,
Yeah.
and we're not there yet.
No.
And maybe it takes until four, five,
I
or
think
six.
four
Like,
is maybe four is really the one that I think that I would first consider, like, where they
is that the
really start to
turn?
care. I think that's the turn. I think most people would cite that as the big turn, because three is still, like, it's more than two. Two is more than one, but one is
Yeah,
almost nothing. So we're you know we're
right.
we're you know we're iterating in very small increments. Then all of a sudden, there's something of a shift that happens. I think with four, and we'll see that as we get there. Where because I think about, you're talking about the character art, right? Like the art that Yoshitaka Amano drew, right, for this, like the cover art and his character designs and stuff.
Hmm.
So, like, that carries so much of, like, the narrative in these early games. Is just
That's
his
true.
artwork, right? Like, you
Yeah,
see his art, you see the character designs, the monster designs, and, like, so much of the storytelling is through these things that he drew, right, that they then turned into sprites in the game. And so that's where we get a lot of that. But it's with four that it's like what's in the game, the characters and their interactions, the places they visit, those start to feel a whole lot more meaningful. Because it's interesting that, like, this game really doesn't have much of a story. There's an arc with an emperor who tried to take over the world, blah blah blah.
it's kind of Star Wars.
Yeah. Um,
Like, people
and
say
then
that 12 is Star Wars, but this one is more
a lot
Star
of them
Wars to
are
me
a
than
lot
that
of them
one.
are Star Wars. But, like, that character of Furion, which is a nothing of a character in the game,
Yeah,
people still know, and people still like, and people still recognize this, and it's all because of that Amano art, right? Because it is a classic Final Fantasy character design, one of the coolest he ever did. It was for the second
yeah.
game, and that character is nothing. Like, literally, it's not even a self insert of a character.
No, just a
Like,
husk.
it's just a husk of a character, least interesting protagonist in the entire series, probably. And, like, even less than, at least in the first game, like, the the four party members are meant to be these, like, nobody husks, but here they're like, your side characters are kind of interesting, and so it makes him feel even worse, right? Because he's like
Yeah,
a named known protagonist with a design, but he's super uninteresting,
just
right?
totally empty. Yeah,
And yet his artwork, I still like that artwork's so cool. I play Final Fantasy 14. His armor set is in that game as, like, a bonus that you can get for playing the game for a certain period of time. And it's super cool. But other than that artwork, I don't think anyone would be able to tell you the name of the Final Fantasy 2 protagonist.
no. But the big point about him and the story and just him as a character, and thinking back on our conversation about, like, what is Final Fantasy,
Mm-hmm.
I think the story, when the story gets plugged in, then all of these disparate pieces come together.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
right now it feels like they're separated. They're trying to figure out, like, how to make this game. What is Final Fantasy? And I think
Mm-hmm.
the story, when the stories become really epic and more than good versus evil, blah 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 blah,
Yeah.
I think that's when Final Fantasy really takes off and
Mm-hmm.
becomes the series that we know today.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting because it seems like each of the first three games will introduce some very iconic elements of Final Fantasy. The crystals and class system in one. Um, one thing I forgot about is, rows are introduced. This front row, back row combat, right? For your casters
Oh
and
yeah, I
your
forgot about
melee
that.
attackers, like, that comes in here. But Chocobo, Sid, like, that's this game. Later on, we'll get Moogles, and we'll get, a deeper combat system, or a deeper job system, and, a more refined magic system. And so it's like there's all these iterations in these early games, and at some point, like right around 4 or 5, like, something just gels, right? And all of
Yeah,
these disparate pieces come together. We start to see, the series really take off. What's interesting is this game, for the longest time, right? Final Fantasy 2 was actually Final Fantasy 4 for the US, right? Like, we got Final Fantasy 4 and they called it Final Fantasy 2. So for the longest time, people thought they were playing Final Fantasy 2. They didn't even know that they'd completely missed out on 2 games in the interim that Japan got. So it's interesting to see, now that we've got the Pixel remasters coming back, it's cool to see people going back and trying these first three games that a lot of people just missed, right? Some because they never had an opportunity, others just because the series didn't grab them until 7, 10, whatever. But it overall, I had an actually pretty decent time playing this, right? Like
Yeah,
I
me too.
enjoyed I enjoyed seeing how far the game progressed just from the first to the second entry. I liked the grindiness. Like I think that the excess encounter rate was offset a little bit by the choice to have a non experience based progression system for the characters. It made combat feel more rewarding, right?
Hmm.
Random encounters, I think, feel more rewarding because of the system than they do in a normal Final Fantasy game. That's one thing that I think
Yeah.
people don't talk about enough is that one of the reasons I love the Saga games and one of the reasons I love Final Fantasy 2 so much is every combat feels rewarding because there's always the opportunity for progression, right?
And every
Even
encounter is important, right? Because there are all these like many things you're trying to
right.
accomplish with different
Right.
characters.
So there's so much, like every opportunity you have to cast a new spell, to get attacked, to attack somebody, like is an opportunity for growth in your characters. And with the experience system, the only time that feels rewarding is the one where you go from 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, right? Like it doesn't feel nice watching that gauge run up. It only feels nice watching it tick over, right?
Yeah.
Which is,
And
it's a
sometimes it
distinction,
can
but
be
it's
a
an important
really
one.
long time, right? It can
Yeah.
take a long time to get from one level to another, especially the
Late game.
later game.
Yeah. So I think that's an interesting, like, just like caveat that doesn't get brought up enough about how it does make everything feel a little more meaningful, right? In a game that lacks much of a story, I think that's important, right? And I
Yeah.
think it's a success in that regards. But it's also grindy and a little unintuitive if you don't read up on it first. So I can see why it would be stressful. Plus, you can get the blood sword late game, and it just trivializes the rest of the game anyways. Like I think there's some stuff in this game that is just broken beyond belief, where you can pretty much make the entire last dungeon one hit kills through to the end if you know what you're doing. So it's an interesting game. It's a fun little time capsule of Final Fantasy. We didn't really talk about it yet, but the music in this game, I recommend you go back and check out at least some of the battle themes in here. It's got a few iconic Final Fantasy battle themes that still are some of the best that Uematsu has ever produced. So worth checking out if you like the music of the series.
Yeah, agreed. I don't think we did this for the first one, but let's grade it. Like, how is it as a Final Fantasy game?
Like, are we talking an A through F
Yeah,
scale? Are we talking
let's let's do S through
if we're tier
Z.
listing this? If we're
Yeah, let's
tier
tier
listing
list it.
this, I mean, if we're tier listing it, it's gonna go pretty low on a Final Fantasy tier list. This is probably a C tier Final Fantasy game, right? But if I were giving it a numerical score, my personal bias, I'm giving this a solid 7.58. Right? It's a good game. It's a fun game. It's not. I'd say a 7.58, which that still lands it a C grade, right? Up
Yep.
to a low B, which I think is fair for the game. That's kind of where I'd put it.
Yep. I was thinking a C level two. I was thinking a little lower numerically. If I was going to give it a score, probably lower 70s.
Yeah.
But still a solid game and one that I really enjoyed. It's just knowing what's coming next or what's
Yes.
coming a little later. Um, maybe tamps it down a little bit for me.
I wouldn't replay it. Like, I guess that's
Yeah,
maybe the best way to put it. This isn't one that I'm going to revisit. I don't think I would revisit any of the first three, if I'm being honest, right? I don't think any of those three I ever plan on revisiting. And a part of that is because there's plenty of other games that do the same thing but better. Like the first three Dragon Quest games, I would pick over the first three Final Fantasies, right? So like
agreed.
as we get into 4 and beyond, yeah, then there's some replayability there. There's some stuff that I'm really interested in that I would check out again. But for now, nah. But still, I think worth checking out. If you've never played it, I highly do recommend checking it out just to see what wacky stuff they were trying in this, and to give you a better appreciation for when someone asks you the question, "What is a Final Fantasy?" You can say, "Well, that's a stupid question. Who knows?" Right?
Yeah, who
When the
knows?
next game comes out, I'll tell you. Right? Like that's what a Final Fantasy is. Right? It's when the next game comes out, I'll let you know. And I think that's important. I think this is an important entry for that.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, if you're interested in the Pixel remasters, getting a physical version, go to Play Asia. They were still available as of at least a week ago. So go get it there, and you've got all 6 on the same cartridge. Really cool. All right, let's leave it there and talk about our game recommendations of the week. So
Yeah.
it's been a little while since we've talked about what we've been playing. We've both been very busy, so I'm curious
Yeah.
about what you've been getting into.
So I've been bouncing around quite a bit lately. I mean, obviously, Final Fantasy 16, played it, liked it. Wouldn't say I loved it, but I liked it quite a bit. I've got some thoughts on it, which we'll get to at some point. We may do this series a little out of order as far as recording, because we may want to talk about 16 at some point, while it's still a little fresh. But for now, I'll just say it was a good experience. I've got thoughts, but there's a little bit of a lull right now. I thought about picking up Pikmin 4, but I haven't played any of the other games in the series, so I'm like hesitant to do that. I'm probably going to wait for a discount on it. Not that Nintendo discounts come along very often, but if one does, I may. And
Might
so
pick
in
it
the
up used.
meantime, yeah.
That's what
And
I'm
so
waiting on.
in the meantime, though, I've been revisiting the Trails series of RPGs. This is a series that has it's kind of divisive. It's pretty niche. It's a Nihon Falcom series of Ys fame, right? It's their Legend of Heroes series. Here, lovingly referred to as the Trails series, which for most players consider starting at the Trails in the Sky series, which is pretty much exclusively on PC. So if you have like a Steam Deck, a crappy laptop from the 90s, right? You should check those
It can
games
run it.
out. They're really fun. Yeah, they're pixel, like 16-bit pixel RPGs, but they have really really deep interconnected stories, really interesting magic systems and combat systems that I really enjoy, and some of, at least in the early game, some of the best protagonist writing in RPGs, I think. That goes into the Crossbell series, which is Trails of Azure and Trails to Zero, which just recently came out on the Switch. First time translated officially into English just this last
Hmm.
year, and that's gotten a lot of really good reception from people that have checked those out. And then you got Trails of Cold Steel, which is a 4-game series, but most recently Trails into Reverie, which is a capstone game that plays off and rewards you playing 7 previous 60 plus hour RPGs. It's sort of like a capstone. It literally has 51 characters that you can unlock throughout the game,
Wow.
all of which are actually developed over the series. The previous, actually, it's 6 games for those entries. But it's a series that if you play through the first one, I think if you can commit to playing through the first one, if you get to the end of the first one and you don't like it, bounce off the series. Play Trails in the Sky, the first one. If you don't like it, bounce off the series. You're not going to like the series. If you get to the end of Trails in the Sky and you like it, you will like the rest of the series, is how I tell people about this game. Like, I personally love it. I'm doing a replay. Again, this is 3 games in the Sky series, 2 in the Crossbell series, 4 in the Cold Steel series, plus a standalone, right, that just recently, or a epilogue game that just came out, and another series coming out in a couple years. It's huge. It's massive. It's as big as Final Fantasy, right? Like, but it's niche. They're interesting. They're doing some stuff with the genre that a lot of other games aren't. I recommend you check out the series if you've never done so.
I really like the first one. I'm stuck in the prologue because the prologue is like 40
It's
hours of
very long.
gameplay.
Look,
But it's very
I
cozy. It's
yeah,
very cozy
I
gameplay.
hate being that person that's like, you just gotta commit. You just gotta commit like 30 hours. But it sucks because this really is like the first game in the series. I enjoy like the slow, like relaxing pace of the first game in the series, but like it hits a point about 15 hours in Act 3, I think it is, where it like hits pedal to the floor. It doesn't let up through the second and
Hmm.
third entries of the series. And so like if you can get through the first half of the first game, and if it grabs you at that point, you'll probably be on a ride through the end of the series. That's how it happened to me. I played the first one. It took me 4 attempts. And when I finally beat the first game, I went straight into the second one, beat it within a week, went straight into the third one, beat it within a week, and then picked up, fan translations of the Crossbell series and played those on, translated, purchased copies of the Japanese edition on my PC. So worth checking out, a good series that a lot of people that play it end up really enjoying. So,
Yeah. Sounds
what about
good.
you? What have you been playing? Anything? I know you've been super slammed with work and stuff, but what have you been up to?
I've been bouncing around a little bit. Went back to Tears of the Kingdom just to try to get some armor
Yeah.
sets and stuff I didn't have. Explore more of the depths. I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to get the I can't remember what it's called now, but the depths gear, the armor
Yeah.
that like you wear a black hood and
Yeah.
looks really weird.
The weird
So
executioner suit,
yeah, so I've
cultist executioner suit.
been playing through that again and had a lot of fun with that over the weekend. I kind of bounced off Final Fantasy 16 a little bit lately. I
Yeah.
just haven't been back to it, but I really enjoyed what I played of it. Like um, I really enjoyed the controls of that game. Like I
Yes.
think that they've got the controls really figured out for that kind of action gameplay, which makes sense, right? You've got Devil May Cry's combat.
Pedigree
Uh,
behind it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But outside of those two things, what have I been playing? Um, oh, I went back to Xenoblade Chronicles Three's DLC because I never finished it.
Yeah.
Tears of the Kingdom came out. I think something else was coming out at the same
Yeah.
time, so I just kind of like never finished it. But I didn't get to Shulk and Rex.
Oh, see, that's
So
what you
they're
got to
like,
get. That's what gets interesting.
yeah, so they're like I don't know, 2 or 3 hours into the
Yeah.
DLC. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you've
No,
got
I
to
think
play
that's
a
right.
little bit. Okay, so you've got to play a little bit before you get to them, and it's just like such a drag initially. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
Xenoblade, but it feels like more Xenoblade. But then
It,
when you pull all
yeah.
the characters together, like things start to get really exciting.
It does that same thing where the Xenoblade's combat system does not shine until you have a full party. If you don't have a full party, it's
Yeah.
slow, it's sluggish, it's uninteresting. And then once you get all of the full party abilities and options, it really starts to open up. And then the moment to moment gameplay feels a lot better. But that DLC, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on that DLC when you finish it, if you finish it, because I found it to be phenomenal by the end. I was kind of lukewarm on it until about maybe a fifth of the way through it. It's not super
Hmm.
long, but yeah, until a little after getting all of the party together, I was pretty lukewarm on it, and then it really does some cool, interesting things. And yeah, curious to see what you
How
got to say about it.
how long did it take you? Like 15 hours or so?
I want to say it was around 20,
Oh wow.
25, but
Okay.
I did everything, right? Like I did everything in it. So I think it was about 25 hours with like full completion,
I've been
which
taking my
was a
time
lot of
with
side
it
quests and
too.
stuff like
Like
that.
I'm doing all the side missions, like I'm
Yeah.
exploring all these areas. I like how it gives you a count of like how many treasure troves are left,
Yeah.
how many secret items. So I'm like addicted to doing some of the
Yes,
collectathon
that's what I
stuff.
did, right? I collected all the map items and all of that, right? Like I finished all of that, and it took me around 25 hours or so, I think. It's been a while. I played it pretty much right when it came out and went straight through it. But yeah, I'm. That's a nice little trifecta you got there because I think Tears of the Kingdom, it's a good game to drop in and drop out of, right? Like I've gone
Yeah.
back to it a few times since I completed it because I'm still working on a very slow 100% on it, right? I just got my the strategy guide, the hardcover strategy guide that came out
Oh,
recently. I've
nice.
got that, so I'm going to start doing my Korok hunting soon. But I've been doing little bits and pieces here and there, and it really kind of rewards that. I think Final Fantasy 16 also feels better taking it slow because not to spoil that conversation too much, but the late game when you're rushing through that game and you start getting hit with one side quest at the beginning, two side quests, chapter 3, four side quests, and then all of a sudden it's 15 side quests all at once. And right, like there's some pacing issues in the latter half of that game that really rewards you like just taking your time with it. Just come in, knock out a couple side missions, maybe progress the story a little bit, and then hop out a little bit because the combat feels really good and it's good to play for like an hour or so and then just be like, I'm good, you know.
Yeah. Well, the thing about Zelda and Final Fantasy, you don't get these games, but what, once every console generation,
Yeah,
basically. I mean,
5
Breath of
years
the
at
Wild
best.
was Wii U, so I don't even count that as a Switch game.
Right.
Um, so I just enjoy them. I know we tried to get through them at least enough of them to talk about them pretty
Yeah.
quick after they come out, but I'm really thinking with Final Fantasy 16, I've got to slow down and really appreciate it.
Yeah. I think you'll like it more. I think you'll like it more if you just tell yourself, I'm just going to do a little bit here and there. I think the game benefits from being a slower burn because its flaws become pretty glaring when you try to rush it. That's kind of my
Mm,
critique of it. Is I feel like it was my pace that really kind of soured me on it towards the end.
interesting. All right, let's leave it there. We'll come back. I think probably relatively soon with Final Fantasy 3. You're a decent way through it.
Yeah,
I'm
I've only
probably about
got
halfway.
yeah, I've maybe 2/3 of the way, so I'm not much further than you. I don't think. I think it's another you know 15, 16-hour game if you're using a guide, which again, for these early games, no shame, I'm using a guide. So,
Yeah.
we'll get through it. We'll talk about that one pretty soon. That's probably going to be a lot shorter gap between 2 and 3.
Yeah. All right, guys. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. See you next
Yeah.
week.
Pleasure as always.